Thank you, everyone, for this bringing your whole selves and your open hearts to this last segment of the day. We've talked so much about lived experience expertise here today, and like Bakul mentioned, all of us here are here because perhaps we've been through something in our own families as carers or as people who have dealt with mental health conditions. And there's so much to say and so much power in these narratives. I think regardless of our challenge or our conditions as maybe whether they are labeled as anxiety, depression, OCD, psychosis, or they are not labeled, but they're actually coming from a position of a lot of grief, a lot of trauma. Regardless of that, it is these stories that in a way have defined a large part of our identities. And then it's a journey for ourselves about how we are owning and recreating, reimagining our own identities, our whole selves, and what is that journey of actually sharing it with everyone. And the question is, why share? And someone talked about being a drop in the ocean and how important it is, though, for many drops to come together to become a stream. And so those of us who have been through lived experience journeys and have sort of come together as a tribe of women here to really share and not just go through the journey of sharing with others, but also within our own families. This book process has also enabled conversations within our families with my father and somebody else's parent and child, and we've all been able to begin a dialogue about experiences that happened to us 30, 40 years ago. So the question really is that when we share, who is it reaching? And we've talked about, of course, touching other families and those who are suffering. We hope that we draw courage from each other. Just this room full of people is giving us so much courage to actually be able to open up. We hope that our schools and our colleges and the institutions that we are a part of will also listen in and hopefully learn and grow with us in this journey. We hope that our workplaces and our employers and government and policy makers are able to really see what the lived experiences, what the felt experiences might be when it comes to mental illness, and then actually design systems around that, not to accommodate or not to include. So with that in mind, we have contributors here today of this book, and it's with a lot of pride that I request everyone to unveil the book Homecoming, Mental Health Journeys of Resilience, Healing and Wholeness. If you'd all like to take a copy and unveil. Thank you. Thank you so much. And also wanted to acknowledge those who are not here. There are actually 11 of us who have come together, and I hope many more will join. We hope that this book is an evolving series, and the next version has men, women, and all genders. And so we keep expanding the collective. Aparna Piramal Raje, who couldn't be with us here today, she's in Oxford, has also started this journey by writing a book called Chemical Khichdi, which is her journey about living with bipolar, and it's now a bestseller. So we hope that these narratives become more and more mainstream, and mainstaging that is a real commitment from the India Mental Health Alliance. Would love to invite comments briefly from each of the contributors, but first I hand over to Nandini to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Neha. Good evening, everyone. It does feel very special to be here today. This is not my first book. I guess it's my 10th book. But in the morning when I first saw Homecoming, it just felt so special because there was a creative gestation to Homecoming. It was like actually being a midwifing the whole process. I still remember how Homecoming started off on a journey, a car journey in Bangalore from the Amaha office, along with Neha and Vasvi to the Bangalore airport. And it was a 2-hour journey, so we had a lot of time to actually manifest the book. And then I think when you really want something so badly, as the saying goes, the whole universe conspires to make it happen. And so here we have the book today. Uh, I'm not a keyboard happy author. For me, I am a lived experience. I have a lived experience of suicide loss. So lived experience is very central to the work I do as well. And interestingly enough, my journey as a lived experience advocate has been very organic. I say this because I'd like to place things in perspective. I have a PhD in gender studies, and back in the mid 1990s and early 2000, I started working in community-based HIV/AIDS initiatives. And that was when I saw for myself the power and impact of people with lived experience. Of course, I had no lived experience myself, and I went in there as an arrogant consultant, full of academic, bookish knowledge. And the community told us, "You don't know anything, listen to us." That was so humbling. Of course, at that point, I didn't realize that one day maybe the professional would also become personal. But today, when I look back, I realize maybe, not maybe, things do happen for a purpose. In 2017, I lost my spouse to suicide. And then I realized that it was very important to not only change the narrative, but to challenge the narrative. For me, as an author, as a writer, the universe is made of stories, not atoms. In fact, in the morning when I was listening to Dr. Shelja Sen talk about a tree is as strong as the forest around it, I started jotting it down, and I lead a postvention group for rural women impacted by suicide loss. And I said during our next session, this would be the thematic. How do we place it in the context of suicide loss? For me, stories are not numbers. Stories are not data points either. Numbers inform, statistics inform, but stories transform. Listening to the absolute courage and the truth and the lived realities of the 10 remarkable women who shared their stories with us was a very, very deeply humbling experience. It is actually a very sacred act of witnessing your journeys. And for that, Neha and I remain eternally grateful. Thank you so much. It was a very new experience for me witnessing someone's journey. I've witnessed my own journey. That was what Left Behind Surviving Suicide was all about. But witnessing someone else's journey was an altogether new experience. There was a great sense of responsibility. There was also a great deal of sensitivity and sensibility involved. And shaping these narratives was actually helped us to understand ourselves better. I could go on and on and on, but I think narratives have so much of power, the ability to transform, and I think that this would be the beginning of more narratives to come, because that's how we change the world, one story at a time, one person at a time, one voice at a time, one narrative at a time. Thank you.
Maybe invite comments, maybe 2-3 minutes briefly from each contributor, and perhaps in the order that we've gone in the book. Purnima, would you like to kick us off?
It's a privilege and almost unbelievable to think of standing here in front of so many of you who care deeply about mental health and who work in spaces related to mental health. And the fact that all of you are here to witness and hold space for lived experience. And that's going to take some time for me, for all of it to sink in. just to kind of give a little bit of professional context about me, I am an assistant professor of psychology. I'm also a psychotherapist and a researcher and a lived experience ambassador on the steering council at IMHA. My chapter in Homecoming is titled When Pain Shapes Purpose. The pain in the chapter, I write about experiences of trauma, of child sexual abuse, of rape, and of being re-traumatized by mental health systems that are actually supposed to be spaces that provide safety and care. I live with complex PTSD, bipolar 1 disorder, and autism. For years, I kept asking myself one question: why me? And I've never been able to find the answer for that. But I wanted to create an answer, and that's where I wanted to create purpose. And that purpose for me has been being a part of the mental health landscape in India, as an educator, as a psychotherapist, as a researcher, but also about amplifying and stabilizing voices of lived experience, ensuring that they're not heard as afterthoughts, but as truths that shape the field. For me, this is really not about telling my story, and lived experience expertise does not mean that for me. But in the process of sharing, holding on to that small hope that someone somewhere is able to access some parts of themselves that may be silenced by shame or silenced by stigma. When we acknowledge the value of lived experience, we shift from a model of fixing people. We move towards a model of truly listening to them. We create spaces that honor people as experts in their own lives, and that in that honoring, we make room for agency, for reclaiming agency and dignity. And lived experience is not really about pain alone, but also about stories of recovery, stories of hope, stories of joy, and stories of play, love, friendship, connection, and community. And I think it's important to embrace and acknowledge that as well. And so every time when I sit with somebody in front of me, be it a client or a research participant or a student, for me, their humanity and their stories are primary. My professional knowledge or clinical training or research expertise is always secondary, and they only have meaning if they serve to hold, honor, and respect the truth of the people, truth of the person sitting in front of me. And this is also the question I want to leave all of us with. When we're looking at working across sectors, be it health, education, mental health, workspace, policy, how do we ensure that they're built not only on professional knowledge, but also on lived wisdom? How do we stop treating lived experience as anecdotal and instead recognize it as a form of valid and important expertise? And I think the answer really begins with each of us, in how we teach, in how we research, in how we provide care, and how we design systems that shape lives. It begins when we stop asking whether lived experience really belongs in professional spaces and instead ask, how can we afford to exclude it? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Purnima. May I invite Kavita to say a few words?
Good afternoon. I'm not sure I know what to say, so I'm just going to put out a couple of dilemmas that I'm still sitting with. It's been quite a journey with the book. I think the first thing I want to say is I don't think that I would have had I don't want to call it courage, but the ability to tell this story if it hadn't been for all of you and for Nandini and Neha to be doing this. So if it was going to be just one story, I don't think I would have managed to do it. So I'm very thankful for the tribe which actually said we are all willing to share our stories because they're very deeply personal. Which brings me to my sort of question or dilemma of why now. I'm in my early 50s. My story is a lot to do with my mother, my childhood. My mother had schizophrenia. Why now? And I grew up to be a psychiatrist, but for a large part of my practice, the outing of the lived experience that my mother had schizophrenia, and therefore there is a certain amount of, I'd like to call it knowledge, but experience, that one has had in the living out of a household with mental illness. Where does that sit in professional practice? Does one need to hide it? Is it more valuable if you are an objective diagnostician, which is what we were told when we were getting trained? Or is there any value in incorporating it in your practice? And it has taken me all this while to actually start saying, it's all right, I can bring my whole self into this, and I can sit down and sometimes do disclosures. And sometimes when I do understand, I think a little bit more than I would have if I didn't have this, then it's okay to say, oh, that's also knowledge. This is also practice-based evidence rather than just evidence-based practice. So I think this is a dilemma that often I sit with my colleagues as well. I work in an organization, so there are many of us. And we ask ourselves, do we bring our whole selves in, or do we bring our structured expertise selves in? And would that be respected, or will the rest of it also be respected? So it's a dilemma that we often sit with. I think in my opinion, today I sit after 3 decades of working in this and saying, today I think I'll bring my whole self in. So it's taken me a while. But I hope that this is going to remain, and the delayering is going to happen more and more. I think the second question that I often sit with is, my mother also had other medical disorders. She eventually had 2 different brain tumors. She had diabetes. She had other disorders as well. But when somebody has a mental illness, oftentimes we start questioning their entire identity and the credibility of their word, regardless of what the diagnosis of mental illness is. We may not do that for someone who has cancer or an eye disease or whatever. We would actually ask very respectfully, what are you feeling, what are you doing? But when somebody has mental illness, and this has been my experience despite being a doctor, when I used to take her so eventually her brain tumor got diagnosed after 2.5 years because everybody thought it was still schizophrenia. And nobody agreed to do an MRI because they said, no, but it must be the mental illness. And then we discovered, no, I mean, it had probably been growing for 2.5 years. It was a brain tumor. So I think we often conflate the illness with the identity and with a lot of other dimensions of the identity. And I think this is something that I still struggle with when I'm sitting across a family, where everybody has a different version of the story of the person with the mental illness. And I think the final dilemma that I've always sort of wondered about is which story, which version is valid. Because I'm here today talking about my mother's illness. She's no more. What's her version, or what was her version? Was it not the one that was the most valid? My brother, who's about 1.5 years elder to me, has a different version. And my father has a different version of what happened all those years. So whose version is really valid, and do I have the right to put my version on paper? Because I do believe that when a story becomes part of a book, it will acquire a life of its own. So I think one of the bits of courage was about that. We tell our stories in closed rooms, but putting it on paper and letting it go into the world is going to be another journey. So thank you, Neha and Nandini and Aimee, for yet another exciting journey that I think I will start today.
Thank you, Kavita, and also for bringing all your hats and the dilemmas and contradictions, but also the ongoing harmony that you are trying to create across all of that. May I invite Sidra to say a few words?
I think going through what I went through was a little less difficult than sharing my story, because every time I shared it, I felt let down by so many people, and I had become this person, this vindictive version of myself that I wanted to inflict pain, I think, and wanted everyone to experience what I was going through. There's, I think, one person that I have not thanked enough. I think it's Bakul, my friend. She's in the audience. I clearly remember I met her around 12 years ago. And she was the first person, even before I told my family I was feeling, she was the first person I shared how I was feeling. And she invited me into her life and into her home after all the discussions that have happened here today. And I've seen and I've understood the work that IMHA is doing. My only hope and ask from people in this room is that treatment, if we could probably try to make the treatment a little more interactive, a little more balanced. I have talked about this earlier, and the pros and cons of the medication. So the pro is the symptoms are alleviated. And the cons are ki theek hai, there's some weight gain, there's some probably weak eyesight, there's some drowsiness, and the mental health professional themselves, they decide that the pros outweigh the cons. Can we ask the person who's actually taking the medication, are you okay with those cons? Because when I was taking those medications, I think I would have, and I don't want to fat shame anyone, and but it's just me that I don't want to be fat. And I know that I'm fat. I don't want to be fat. Those medicines made me fat. I tried to die, because I would rather die than. So the cons really affect me, and it should be at least an interaction, at least a conversation, if not entirely my decision, because I understand that I'm a client, I'm a patient, I need help. I would probably appreciate that. And this whole conversation, it's amazing to hear how we've been talking about lived experience as expertise. I do hope that we are embedding this in the training of mental health professionals, because you're creating a need for people. There is a demand, and I do hope that there is a supply for it. So thank you so much.
Sidra, thank you so much for that, and also for the courage to shed those tears on behalf of all of us who are smiling. But we all bear your pain, and we stand in solidarity. Kairavi, our youngest contributor, would love to hear from you now. I know you've written about this before in your younger days, so please share.
Hi, I am Kairavi Bharatram. I've been struggling with depression and anxiety since I was around 17 years old, around 10 years ago. Along the journey, we discovered ADHD, bipolar, so literally the whole psychology syllabus. But I just feel really happy that we're talking about lived experience, not just from the patient's point of view, but also the people around them. And in this book, you hear me and you sense a tone of frustration towards my parents in the beginning of this journey of how they didn't get it. And I'm really happy that that's there, because it shows you how much growth is possible. Because today we're all sitting in this room, and IMHA exists because my parents supported me through those 10 years and now want to help other people out there too. So course, the same parents who were scared to talk about what is going on are right now taking videos and have put me up on stage. So I just want to say, take this opportunity to say, Mom, Dad, Mercy, and Dr. Send, I am here because of you, and thank you for everything that you do. And also the importance of sharing your story. Again, IMHA is here because we decided to be open about it. I published a book when I was 21 on depression for kids, and we were really scared that at that time, if I talk about it, what will the reaction be? Will I get labeled? But the number of people who came, I mean, it was 100% positive reaction. And that's why when I was asked, you want to share your story in this book, it was a no-brainer, because for two reasons. One, if what I went through can help even one more person out there, it feels like what I went through was a little bit more worth it. And second is a more selfish reason. As someone with low self-esteem, when I talk about my story and a stranger comes to me and says that, oh, you're so strong, then maybe I can view myself as strong also. So thank you, Neha, for giving me this opportunity, and thank you for everybody who works in this space and for everything that you do.
Today's been a day of being inspired by the young. So thank you, Teravi, for that. And we're going to switch generations now and go on to Dr. Godrej, who has shared her family's journey and also a little bit about her daughter. And would you like to take the mic, Ms. Godrej?
So it has been a difficult day for many of us, but I'm at the 7th decade of my life, and I have been talking about this quite openly because I needed answers. I was just not getting answers. You mentioned medication, even that was a rigmarole. Is it the right one? Is it the right diagnosis? Kid is bright, has a good IQ. What is happening? And this was 4 decades ago. It was tough, and one had to really, and be qualified educationist. I couldn't put my finger on the pulse, which is even more frustrating. And the people I went to from the education point of view, not from the medical point of view, couldn't put a finger on the pulse either. There was something wrong with the education my generation received. Not talking about child rearing, but I'm talking about education in the truest sense, that these subjects were not even addressed in the humanities. And they should have started over there. In science, you expect it, but in the humanities, we should have it. I also always say to women that we must learn the Constitution of India, because if we don't know what the Constitution of India, we won't know what our rights are. So similarly in mental health also, we need to know the Mental Health Act. We need to know the education policies that are thrown at us, and we need to educate ourselves. It is no point saying, oh, I have this degree and that degree, and saying I know it all and be arrogant about it. It doesn't work. When Neha broached me with this subject, I said, how much time do I have? And she very kindly said that, no, we'll help you with it. All you have to do is speak. And I don't know how long we spoke for, but it was for 2 sessions definitely, over maybe, it just went on and on, 2 or 3 hours, I think. And she really did a great service because it helped me clarify my own thoughts. And you can have thoughts, you can have conversations, but boy, when you put that word into print, everybody's going to read it. So you better get it right then. So I haven't prepared anything, and I'm not making a plug for Homecoming, but do get a copy of it. But I'll just read a few things from the book, which I think is relevant. It's a long chapter. It's called The Canvas of Compassion. And every human being can understand those two words. Canvas, painting, which is close to my heart, and compassion. I think we're all born with it, but we sometimes suppress it. We shouldn't suppress it. It's a very, very important emotion. So my life is intertwined with art, a canvas painted with passion, perseverance, persistence, patience, and an unwavering gaze into an uncertain future. Nandini, I couldn't have put it any better than that. That's her words and my thoughts. So I would really like to thank you for doing this. When you came to me, I didn't really know how. This is a strange part is homecoming. It really is, because all these brave women have opened their hearts, their minds. I've opened my soul, and it's good to do that sometimes. If you shed a tear, you reflect, your voice is wavering, there's nothing wrong in that. And I think both men and women must do that from time to time. We're really slightly differently wired, but we came from the same source, our mothers and our fathers. So, and of course, we have our genes with us and our parents with us, grandparents. Sometimes grandparents don't understand what's happening in life. So, this book is a culmination of many things. Our family's approach to caregiving has evolved into a seamless tapestry of interconnected responsibilities rather than isolated compartments of duty. At the heart of this philosophy lies our commitment to supporting elderly relatives grappling with Alzheimer's and dementia, a challenge deeply rooted in our family history. I talked about OCD and anxiety and learning disabilities. But these are two, as our population, the world population keeps aging, Alzheimer's and dementia is in our backyard. And we in India are blessed because we have something called the family spirit. We're not gone into a nuclear family like they've gone into the Western world, where the nuclear family has demanded nursing homes and caregiving centers, and it just gets more and more frightening for the people who are institutionalized. So we are really lucky that we have the nuclear family, the extended family to support us. I often reflect on my paternal grandfather's unwavering dedication after the devastating loss of both his wife and his daughter. His fierce protectiveness of my father's well-being, born from profound loss and love, has become a guiding light in our own caregiving journey. This legacy of attentive care has taught us that true support transcends mere duty. It's an act of love that requires both emotional intelligence and practical wisdom, weaving together needs of multiple generations into a cohesive embrace. The cornerstone of this resilience lies in my carefully calibrated time allocation. Time for me is, I wish there were friends tell me, you should have 36 hours in your day. I said, I wish I could. And the next response is, you'll be a horrible person to live with. So this isn't merely about time management, it's about emotional sustainability. The hours spent pursuing personal interests, maintaining friendships, or simply sitting quietly with a book aren't indulgences, but investments that replenish the well of patience and compassion essential for caregiving. I think if it was a Nobel Prize for patience, I should get it. Maybe all of us should get it after listening to everyone today. Unlike traditional advice that often suggests rigid compartmentalization of roles, I've discovered the power of fluid transitions. Some days this means taking a work call while accompanying a family member to therapy, or finding moments of meditation in hospital waiting rooms. This seamless integration of responsibilities rather than strict separation creates a rhythm that feels both natural and sustainable. It's a dance of priorities that allows me to be fully present in each moment while maintaining the energy reserves necessary for a long journey of caregiving. And I'll just end by saying, while the challenges we face in today's world can seem overwhelming, I've discovered that the antidote often lies in simple acts of connection and generosity. These moments of shared humanity, whether through supporting local initiatives or nurturing long-standing friendships, remind us that we're all part of something much larger than ourselves. As I reflect on my journey, I'm convinced that the most meaningful legacy isn't built through grand gestures or carefully managed endowments, but through the countless small acts of kindness that weave together to create the fabric of a community. In the end, what truly matters isn't what we accumulate or achieve, but the lives we touch, the hearts we open, and the hope we nurture. One drop at a time, one precious moment at a time. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much for that, Ms. Godrej. And our last contributor for today, Janani. We've done so much talking about schools and classrooms and the role of teachers. And so here is a model teacher whom many of us look up to. And thank you for being part of this journey.
I'm Janani, and I'm a teacher at the Sri Ram School. Something I'm very, very proud of that I do. I love being a teacher. The other day we had this round happening in our school. They asked, if not teaching, then what? I really went blank. I didn't know what, because I think that's something. But that's not how my journey started. I never wanted to be a teacher. And honestly speaking, this may sound a little not so correct, but I really thought people who don't have anything to do become teachers and keep justifying it for the rest of their life. Oh, what a noble thing we are doing. Yeah. When I chose to contribute to this story, a very, very motivating factor for me was how I also believe that lived experiences matter in the way we think about mental health. And that's been my experience in classrooms with children, is collecting their lived experiences too. I'm sure many of you will resonate with story of mine, that many of us must have grown up in classrooms where shame, fear, humiliation were equated to discipline and building character. How many of you have experienced that? I'd like to have a show of hands. Wow. Oh, that's wonderful. So many of us. But it also made me realize that this whole silencing of shame has to be challenged. And that's exactly what I think this book helped me do. Through Homecoming, it was about challenging my shame, putting my story out there. I wouldn't say that I did not feel nervous when the first draft was sent. I was thinking, oh, do I really want to share so much? But then it also came back to that the only way I could get over it was by challenging my shame. And flipping the gaze on the fact that, see how far I've come. And also the way in which my resilience has shaped. Isn't that what I talk to children? So I also had to live that. So that was one of the things. Thank you so much for that. In my years of work with children, I have realized that you could be enrolled into the best world-class curriculum, but if your emotional well-being is not in place, no learning will happen. And that's the unfortunate part. In classrooms, shame continues to be in the name of supporting or maybe making kids strong, but we know how many kids go broken home every day. And those are the stories that we hear and sometimes never even hear it. However, compassion and building strong classroom communities is the only way. Spending more time on getting kids together to share their stories exactly as all of us are doing is the way with which we actually give respect to every child's story. And that's where the confidence is. So finally, the choice is with us, whether we wish to continue to play out that cycle of shame, smallness, and silence, or we can bring in a new system of,
bringing in more support for kids and giving an uplift to their dignity and to safety. That's what sums up Homecoming for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Janani. And drawing courage from all of you and bringing my whole self into the room, just to share that my chapter in the book is really a tribute to some of the traumas and complexities, but also some of the resilience and strengths that we have grown to have as a family and as individuals. This story stands to represent many versions, and maybe they're all the same or they're all very different, as Kavita mentioned. But a family of 4, we had very different trajectories and experiences, and yet we are the typical mother, father, brother, sister that you would look at in a normal Delhi home. I unfortunately lost my younger brother. He died by suicide 5 years ago. So for me, this book is a tribute to him. And 18 September was his death anniversary. And so it really is a homecoming as a tribute for that to come a full circle. My mother, on the other hand, is doing very well, completely stable on 1 injection every 3 weeks for the last 15 years after being untreated and undiagnosed for 20 years and being homeless and living rather sort of an unsheltered life while she had gone away for a period of 10 years. And so hope, as Rohini was talking about earlier today, hope is really something that we have to all hold on to with all we've got. And of course, my father, who has come a long way in this journey of mental health from 5 years ago when I started working in this space, and I did a little talk, and it was quite hard for the whole family to take, to being here today and celebrating this. And he sent me a message this morning saying, this is the first time I have read and understood what your childhood was like. And you're a brave girl and you have my blessings, and we'll all do the best we can. So thank you.